Okay. Good afternoon, all. I welcome you all for this today's panel discussion approach to secretary diet. We have panelists Dr. Sandeep, Dr. Manis, and Dr. Jatin. Uh, uh, Jatin, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Please, next slide. So this panel discussion will be around the case scenario. So we have a case of 60-year-old female patient. She's having large volume painless watery diarrhea. The frequency of 6 per day, 2 per night, and duration of around 6 months. It require multiple hospitalization, and she had a past history of prerenal legitimia and hypokalemia, which required IV correction and fluid resuscitation. And during this last 6 months, she had a weight loss of around 15 kg. So I would like to invite Dr. Jatin for his opinion regarding what is the probable diagnosis in this case and how you want to approach. Dr. Jatin, please.
Good evening, everyone. So here we have a 60-year-old female patient. Uh, with a chronic diarrhea. So in any patient with chronic diarrhea, we systematically approach the patient with 7 questions. Whether it is functional or organic, whether it is small bowel or large bowel origin, whether it is associated with any malabsorption, does patient have any associated pain or colicky pain abdomen, does the patient have any inflammatory features like fever or joint pains, and if it is watery type of diarrhea, then whether it is osmotic or secretory. So if we analyze this patient has a large volume, and she has nocturnal symptoms also, and the patient also has weight loss. So nocturnal symptoms and weight loss indicate that this patient does not have any functional, and this is definitely organic. So any diarrhea which is more than 4 weeks is termed as chronic diarrhea. So this patient has 6 months duration. So, and important thing is that this patient clearly gives the history of watery stools. So and the patient does not have any history of bleeding PR or other rectal urgency or tenesmus to suggest that this is large bowel in origin. And another important finding is that this patient had significant dehydration and multiple hospitalization, where she was found to have hypokalemia and azotemia. The importance of this finding we will discuss subsequently. So based on this history, this patient has organic and likely no features of large bowel type or malabsorption features, no pain, non-inflammatory. So I would like to keep the possibility of secretory diarrhea as a syndromic diagnosis in this patient with large volume watery diarrhea with episodes of severe dehydration. Mahendra, sir?
So why you are keeping it secretory diarrhea and how you're keeping it secretory diarrhea?
Broadly, the most common cause of small bowel diarrhea is malabsorption diarrhea. So in 2 different categories, 2 different contenders are the malabsorption and secretory diarrhea are the 2 main contenders. In malabsorption, the unabsorbed carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, they form osmotic molecules. In the small bowel, they are not absorbed. And these carry a lot of water along with it osmotic load to the colon. And colon has a capacity to absorb around 5 liters of water, but not the unabsorbed carbohydrates. So in patients with mucosal malabsorption disease like celiac or any other malabsorption diseases, there is increased stool volume, but it is never classically described as a watery stool. So when there is water in the stool, that means that there is a pathology which is affecting both the small intestine as well as large intestine, thereby inhibiting the compensatory colonic water reabsorption mechanism. Since there is a typical watery description, so I would like to jump directly to a pure secretory form of a diarrhea, and I would not like to consider malabsorptive diarrhea in this patient.
So the history of malabsorption or deficiency you would like to ask before jumping into the secretory type of diarrhea?
Yes, sir. For carbohydrate malabsorption, we usually ask for any bloating, and for protein malabsorption, we ask for pedal edema and weight loss. So this patient did not have any features of bloating or steatorrhea or pedal edema. The weight loss which is there, which can also be present with tumors, which can lead to secretory diarrhea.
Okay, next slide. So how will anybody? Dr. Piyush, are you there? Piyush, Vikas, Dr. Vikas Banyal.
Yes, sir.
So you have listened to the history, the 60-year-old female with the chronic watery diarrhea for 6 month duration.
ये स्टार्ट हो गया
How
क्या
will-
सेमिनार? हेलो
Sir, panel discussion है sir. Sir, continue करें sir.
ये किसने स्लाइड बनाई है ये वाली? हाउ वुड यू लाइक टू इन्वेस्टिगेट दिस पेशेंट?
ये सर जतिन ने.
ये क्या एसएमएस है क्या?
नहीं सर, इसमें आएगा सर अभी.
नहीं तो यू क्या मतलब इन द सेंस कि ये क्या नया इंग्लिश का टर्म है क्या? आई थॉट यू वाज ऑलवेज वाई और यू और यू
Oh, yes, yes.
नया कोई हाँ
Sorry, sir.
हाँ सर.
लैंग्वेज काइंडली विपिन ने भी ज्वाइन किया हुआ है आज. विपिन विल गिव स्पेशल कमेंट्स टुडे. हाँ
Sir, Vipin sir is there sir.
हाँ वही मैं कहा विपिन विल गिव स्पेशल कमेंट्स.
So Dr. Piyush, how would you like to investigate this case? You have listened to the history.
So first, stool routine and culture we will get it done for atypical parasites also, ova cyst. And then, so first before considering it to be a secretory diarrhea, we need to rule out other causes also if we are starting to investigate the patient. So blanket investigations like stool routine examinations, and then.
So what will be your next step in this case? That Jatin is saying this is a case of secretory diarrhea. Now, what next investigation you will advise? Or anything else you want to ask in history or whatever? Anybody
So
can.
stool osmolality, we can to confirm it, we can get stool osmolality done.
Okay.
And then once we are sure on stool osmolality that this is secretory type of diarrhea, then we can.
Okay, so that's right. Dr. Manas, you want to explain this?
Yes, sir. Basically, since the patient is giving classical history of watery diarrhea, not following the routine algorithm for the classical evaluation of small bowel or large bowel type of diarrhea, we should directly investigate the patient, and we can avoid the unnecessary investigations in this patient. However, our patient, as per classical approach, underwent the routine battery of investigation, and these are the reports where the HIV serology was negative, thyroid profile was normal, IgA TTG was normal, immunoglobulin levels was normal, E2 biopsy was showing no evidence of any celiac disease or tropical screw, colonoscopy was normal, and CT enterography was also normal.
Go back, Manas. So on the basis of history, I'm just asking, just pointing a question that on the basis of history, you find that the patient has secretory diarrhea. So do we need to like IgA TTG or thyroid profile, immunoglobulin level? Do we need all these investigations, or we should do in all these patients?
No, this patient does not require all this battery of investigation except this thyroid profile. We can directly, even thyroid profile.
Your voice is not audible.
Sir, no, sir. All this investigation can be avoided in the patient who is giving classical history of secretory diarrhea.
Okay, next. So how would you like to confirm this diagnosis of secretory diarrhea, as now you're suspected and all the routine investigation which the patient got from outside is normal? So how do you want to approach this?
Sir, I would like to have three. I would approach like in these three ways. First of all, I will ask a patient to collect the stool, and I would have on that basis I would have I can see the amount and the consistency of the stool. So if there is a large watery stool, it will directly clearly suggests that it is a secretory type of diarrhea. Subsequently, I would like to do the fasting test in this patient. And
Manas,
yes, sir.
Manas.
Yes, sir.
So, what is the meaning by large volume? Is there any way to characterize? I mean, is there any way to have a objectivity in a large volume, calling it large volume or a small volume? Is there any objective criteria or a study
And
has
adding
looked
to
at it?
Deepak's question, is the large volume, is there any specific definition? Large volume is one is to differentiate between small bowel diarrhea and large bowel diarrhea. Another is in secretory diarrhea. Is there a cutoff for large volume? So there are two parts to this question. One is what Deepak is asking. Second is what I add to it. In secretory diarrhea particularly, is there a cutoff in terms of volume for large volume?
Sir, the patient is having recurrent hospitalization for the features of dehydration and azotemia. This suggests that patient is having significant loss of volume. So, sir, exactly, I am not aware regarding the cutoff of the.
Sir, in usual approach between differentiation of large and small bowel, exact cutoff of quantity of small bowel to large bowel we did not come across, sir. But usually we take it as a syndrome, sir. Large bowel usually have features of rectal symptoms, small quantity, because rectum acts as a reservoir. When there is proctitis, the frequency increases, and frequently there is passage of very small quantity of semi-solid stools, sometimes mixed with blood. So this is typical large bowel type of diarrhea, wherein small bowel there is since there is malabsorption, the unabsorbed carbohydrates, proteins will draw a lot amount of water, and the frequency will be less, but the volume will be more compared to rectal. Although the distinction between the exact cutoff for the volume is not known. In specific cases of secretory diarrhea like VIP OMA, they have said that it is usually more than 1 liter, and it is typically watery. And for defining diarrhea, also the Western definition says that more than 200 grams of, but it doesn't hold true for Indian settings. That is the thing.
So just exploring it further,
Sir.
that we don't know what is large volume or, but as Manas has told, the dehydration. So dehydration, I think, suppose that you are telling 1 liter. I think 1 liter diarrhea will not lead to problem in adult patient. However, it will definitely be a problematic in child patient. So a sign of a dehydration in a children is really a sinister sign rather than in adult. So, I mean, how to corroborate that? You are telling if a patient has sign of dehydration, this is large volume diarrhea.
Even in
So generally an adult patient can please.
Mahendra sir.
Jatin, please continue. नहीं बोलो कोई बात नहीं बोलो.
Sir, even in adult patient, like for example, this patient is an adult patient who is having significant dehydration, and subsequently we'll know that this patient 24-hour collection turned out to be 2.4 liters. So such large volume even in adults can cause significant dehydration, especially in patients with neuroendocrine tumors.
So other question is, when you are telling the patient has large volume diarrhea, or suppose that we want to objectify it, how would you ask patient, or how we can ask patients to collect, I mean, to quantify the volume or collect the stools to quantify the volume? Is there any way, like the same difficulty happens in children also for collecting urine and a stool, because children pass simultaneously urine and a stool. That's very difficult in child particularly. So is there any way to, I mean, we do in like 24-hour fecal fat, we do collect, but for in diarrhea patients, I mean, has anybody has looked at this aspect?
So in some Western literature, I've come across the specialized containers where they fit into the commode, sir, where it will automatically separate the urine and the stool output. So we just have to fit that container into the Western commode, and every time it just gets collecting, we have to transfer it to a container. But I'm not aware of Indian companies selling such kind of containers. But definitely it
Okay.
is very cumbersome and practically very difficult to collect the stools.
Manas,
So by these three ways, I would like to proceed further.
Manas,
Yes,
how long will you ask the patient to fast for fasting test?
sir. That I will come in the subsequent slides. So at this time, it is since the patient is giving the history of large volume diarrhea, we should differentiate it from the classical secretory type of diarrhea from the osmotic diarrhea. So in osmotic diarrhea, the volume will usually slow and it ceases with the fasting. Whereas in secretory diarrhea, the diarrhea passes with the even on the fasting. So how will we do the fasting test? That is the next question. So I would like to do the fasting test after admitting the patient. Specifically, one should not consider the fasting test as just overnight fast of the patient, and one should look for the cessation of the diarrhea. So ideally for that, patient should be kept nil per orally for 72 hours. After admitting the patient, the electrolyte balance and hydration should be maintained with the IV fluids. And subsequently, if the diarrhea resolves, then it is suggestive of osmotic diarrhea, whereas classical secretory diarrhea does not resolve with the fasting. However,
और तुम 3 दिन तक पेशेंट को फास्टिंग रखोगे क्या? या is it less than 400 calories a day? What is it? 3 दिन तक फास्टिंग रखोगे पेशेंट को?
yes, sir.
वो वैसे ही मैल अब्जॉर्प्शन के साथ आया, तुम उसके बाद क्या फिर अपना एक एलिमेंट और जोड़ दोगे उसमें?
Sir,
The classical definition was that if you have to keep fasting, you keep fasting for less than 24 hours. So the practical definition, the classical definition was 72 hours, but उसमें भी थोड़े calories तो देते हैं ना, maybe less than 400 calories a day or something. तो कुछ तो देना पड़ेगा ना. 3 days बिल्कुल fasting नहीं रखोगे. And secondly, more than fasting is, you can simply look at the sodium and potassium and the osmolar gap. Third, no diarrhea. Many of the times you will have both the components, osmotic diarrhea as well as secretory diarrhea. Fourth, osmotic diarrhea में specific precipitants होते हैं, so you can also look for historically if those precipitants are there कि lactose, magnesium या जो sweeteners होते हैं वो है कि नहीं है.
yes.
So,
Sir,
हाँ, इसका चेक करो, ये डेफिनेशन का 72 आवर्स कंप्लीट फास्टिंग है, लेस देन 400 कैलोरीज अ डे है, और अगर कंप्लीट फास्टिंग रखना है तो 1 day is more than sufficient.
yes.
Sir, is there any relevance of these tests in today's time? I mean, I don't know.
No, except for osmotic gap, there is no relevance of these tests. Generally, most of the times, osmotic diarrhea में भी वही है कि 24 hours आप करना चाहो तो कर लो, otherwise नहीं है, कोई relevance नहीं है.
Okay, sir.
Jatin, next slide. Explain this osmotic gap. So osmotic gap, in order to understand what is osmotic gap, and for example, we can take a patient with malabsorption where in the intralumen colon does not have the capacity to maintain an osmotic gradient with the serum. So whatever the fluid is there in the colon, it will have the same osmolality as that in the serum, that is 290 milliosmoles. So the 290 milliosmoles in the colon, in patients with malabsorbed diarrhea, there is large amount of unabsorbed carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So these are the osmoles which constitute the majority of patients with malabsorption. So which is an osmotic type of diarrhea. So here the contribution of sodium and potassium towards the osmolarity of the fluid is less when compared to, sir.
So you have told carbohydrate, protein, and fat.
Sir,
I think this is digested product of all these three, or it is like a complete carbohydrate, protein, and fat.
sir, like we have the enzymes to.
I don't think that
Sir, in a crude manner, I said
complete
sir, that
product of
disaccharide.
carbohydrate, protein, and fat will contribute to the osmoles. It is only product of all these.
So like the end products of fat digestion, like triglycerides and the dipeptides, up to the terminal step they get dissolved, but mucosal brush border enzymes have the disaccharidases which convert it into simple molecules and get transported. So these molecules in patients with diffuse mucosal malabsorption, these will remain inside the intestinal lumen. So these will exert osmotic force and they will carry water along with it to the colon.
These are the products. What are you telling me?
Sir,
Jatin, these are
Sir.
products of all those things. This is not
Yes, yes,
carbohydrate,
partially-
protein, and fat.
no, sir, no, sir. The
Partially digested.
partially digested
Okay.
proteins which are not absorbed, like for example disaccharides and dipeptides and triglycerides, these are the end products of digestion which are not able to absorb. So these will contribute to 290. For simplicity, I have said these things. So in this, the component of sodium and potassium contributing to the osmolality will be reduced as compared to a secretory diarrhea where there is an endogenous or exogenous molecule which is stimulating the membrane to secrete a lot of sodium and potassium. So here the sodium and potassium concentration is very high and this will contribute to the osmolality rather than the partially digested carbohydrate, fat or protein. So now what we can do, when we get the stool for analysis, we can only measure the stool sodium, stool potassium and stool osmolality, but we cannot measure the end products of partially digested nutrients. So what we'll do is, this is the calculated osmolality. When we calculate stool osmolality, it is usually around 290. In a patient, we can have 280 to 95, something around that. So this is a calculated osmolality in this patient. And next, what is the measured osmolality? So we can calculate the stool sodium, stool potassium. So this will lead to measured osmolality. Sorry, I'm sorry. So this is the measured, sir. This is the calculated. I'm sorry. This is what we measure. And this, how are we calculating this osmolality? It is 2 into sodium plus potassium is contributing to the osmolality. So we assume that the sodium and potassium are the predominant cations, and subsequently they are accompanied by anions. So that's why we have multiplied by 2. For example, if the sodium is 110 in the stool and potassium is 30, then it will be 260, and 2 into this product will be 260. And we have measured it as 290. 280, for example. Here, now the osmotic gap will be, osmotic gap is equal to the measured osmolality minus the 2 into sodium plus potassium. So here 290 minus 260 is equal to 20. So the normal osmotic gap, we take it as less than 50. So in simple words, this is a normal osmotic gap, which is typical in secretory diarrhea. The concept is that whenever there is sodium and potassium secretion is more in secretory diarrhea, automatically the gap is less. In contrast to these malabsorption patients where the sodium and potassium are less. So this will become less and the osmotic gap will increase. So hence in patients with osmotic diarrhea, the osmotic gap is usually high. For example, the cutoff is taken as usually 125, and between 50 and 150 it is indeterminate, mixed type of diarrhea.
Jatin,
Sir?
Is there any way to specifically collect the stool sample for osmotic gap, or you directly collect in a vial and send it to the lab?
Sir, I did not come across any special precautions, but usually freshly collected sample is sent to the lab.
Okay.
But the only special precaution that should be taken is do not mix with the urine. Because while passing stool, it should not be mixed with the urine.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So as explained earlier, the osmolality of the fluid in the colon will be equal to like that of the plasma. So the fluid in the colon will have same osmolarity as of the plasma, that is 290 milliosmol. And the osmotic gap is calculated by measured osmolality minus calculated osmolality. So if the osmolality is less than 50 milliosmol per kg, it is considered as secretory diarrhea. Whereas if it is more than 125, it is considered as osmotic diarrhea. And in between the value, it will be the mixed type of diarrhea. Also, the stool pH will help us in the reaching the diagnosis. Like in the carbohydrate malabsorption, the stool pH will be lesser. It is the cutoff taken as 3.3. So it is suggestive of carbohydrate malabsorption. So this was the typical stool analysis, which showed that patient had 2500 gram of stool per day, and calculating the osmolality, the stool sodium was 110, stool potassium was 20, stool chloride was 65, stool bicarbonate was 45. Calculating this as osmolality, 110 plus 20, that is 130, multiplied by 2 is 230, and hence the osmotic gap was 130 into 2, 260, osmotic gap was 30. So this was the classical secretory type of diarrhea with normal pH and normal anion gap.
So is there any role of calculating anion gap in a stool?
Sir? Sir, yes, sir.
Role of anion gap calculating a stool.
Yes, sir. For by calculating the anion gap, sir, we can have idea of any exogenous laxatives are contributing to the diarrhea or not. Suppose this patient has high anion gap, then it would suggest that patient is having exogenous osmotic or exogenous laxative abuse.
So high anion gap means in a stool?
High anion gap will suggest that patient is having some exogenous ions contributing to the
cutoff for calling high anion gap.
Sir, cutoff, sir, I have not come across cutoff.
And we call it high anion gap.
Check कर लेंगे. Manas, will you please check and let us know?
Yes, sir.
Next slide, Jatin. So till now we have learned that the history is very important, the consistency and amount of stool and stool collection is very important to reach to the diagnosis of secretory diarrhea. And as sir said previously, no other investigation is required. As soon as you suspect a secretory diarrhea, the osmolar gap will lead to the confirmation of secretory diarrhea. So the next question will be what are the causes of secretory diarrhea and how we approach to that. So Jatin.
Mahendra, just one point. No? Since we do not have a sodium potassium estimation in the stool, so it does not mean we don't make diagnosis of diarrhea. If somebody has a large volume watery stool which is recurrent, and then you should also suspect this is a secretory form of diarrhea, and you proceed from there. And many institutions around the world, only few have this facility of sodium potassium estimation in the stool. Majority don't have. But again, you make that assumption based upon the volume of stool, which is a most important point. That large volume watery stool is simply one diagnosis, that is secretory diarrhea.
Yes, sir.
If acute, it is acute. If it's chronic, then is most likely a chronic cause or cause you are going to discuss.
He is explaining, sir.
So causes of secretory.
One more thing I want to make out here, because this is a real clinical problem, that once we ask patient history, patient may not always tell you that I'm passing watery stool, but we have to ask this question. Somebody tells that I have a volume is very important, and if somebody passes a high frequency and a high volume, high frequency, high volume, watery is secretory form diarrhea. High frequency, high volume, but more musty stool, then you will think of malabsorption. Patient with malabsorption may not be high frequency, it may be large volume only, frequency may be low, but high frequency, watery form, large volume is simple diagnosis is secretory form of diarrhea. And this may be a very important history, and we should always raise this question in our mind while interrogating the patient for their symptom of diarrhea. All right.
So before we go into the long list of causes of secretory diarrhea described in the textbook, grossly, cholera is a classical form of a secretory diarrhea, which in acute setting will lead to severe large volumes of diarrhea with dehydration. And in chronic setting, there are a list of causes, important of which are endocrinopathies. Before we go into that list, I just want to briefly tell you the mechanism of this secretory diarrhea. So these are the intestinal epithelial membrane, and these are the receptors. So various hormones like VIP or prostaglandins or even somatostatin, these act on the receptors, leading to activation of adenyl cyclase, and the end result is the elevation of cyclic AMP. So there are receptors. Somatostatin has an inhibitory effect on this, and the VIP has a stimulatory effect on this. And even these are the toxins. So this can be similar in acute settings like cholera toxin, Shigella toxin can also increase cyclic GMP, cyclic AMP, like cholera. So increase in the cyclic secondary mediators, these will have an inhibitory effect on sodium and water absorption into the cell, and has a stimulant effect on the secretion of the sodium chloride to CF-TR channels. So various molecules, whether they are taken endogenously or exogenously administered or endogenous hormones, these cause increase in sodium potassium secretion by inhibiting absorption to raise in the cyclic AMP. So in the textbook, there are a lot of long list of causes described in the secretory part. For example, the disordered motility where diabetes, scleroderma, and post-vagotomy, and malignancies like lymphoma, CA colon, villous adenoma of rectum, and even microscopic colitis, bile acid malabsorption, stimulant laxative, and endocrinopathies. While all of these definitely have secretory diarrhea, in clinical practice, we do not find pure secretory form where there is typical watery diarrhea with dehydration. There are multiple mechanisms in any clinical syndrome of diarrhea, and all these other causes is not a pure form. There are multiple mechanisms where secretory mechanism is also one of them. But endocrinopathies is a classical form of pure secretory diarrhea. Since this patient has a classical history with normal osmotic gap and pure secretory form with severe dehydration, we would like to consider endocrinopathies in these patients.
Jatin, what is celiac?
Hello, sir.
What type of diarrhea is celiac disease?
So celiac, so it is a cause of malabsorptive diarrhea, where the products of partially digested nutrients will cause an osmotic effect, and it comes in predominant mechanism is an osmotic mechanism. So usually there are mixed component, like for example, there can be
I think
Saurabh, it will be combined. It will be combined because this is malabsorption. So there are many osmoles in the lumen of intestine. Certainly, this osmotic there. This will also draw some water from the lumen, from the intestinal wall to the lumen. So in anybody who has a mucosal disease, be it celiac, tropical, or CVID, or even for Crohn's disease, will have a combined effect. This is osmotic because of malabsorption, and also all osmotic will have some component of secretion. It will be combined disorder. So all mucosal disorder will be combined disorder, whereas secretory will be they won't be mucosal disease. They only predominant is the secretion. So mucosa absorbs. There's no osmoles in the lumen, but most of the something draws into the lumen. That will be pure form of secretory diarrhea.
okay.
Just the next slide. So we have reached to the diagnosis of secretory diarrhea, and we are very sure that this is because of some endogenously secreted hormone. So list is quite large. We cannot simply go and investigate for each and every hormone. So this is also very important to know that how would you like to further move ahead with this patient. Jatin?
Coming back to our case, which is a case of a secretory diarrhea, large volume, likely due to a neuroendocrine tumor secreting some peptides. The approach to such a patient begins with a thorough history and physical examination. We can get important clues from the clinical manifestations of the patients. This is a list which shows the various neuroendocrine tumors. If we look at each of them, each one has definitive symptoms. For example, a patient with a carcinoid in the GI tract will have flushing, which is typically described as reddish discoloration in the upper chest, neck, and head region, often associated with feeling of warmth and pruritus. Diarrhea, secretory diarrhea is obviously present. He may have palpitations, wheezing, dyspnea, and also carcinoid heart disease. A patient with a VIPoma will have large volumes in liters of secretory diarrhea associated with electrolyte disturbances. A patient with a gastrinoma will have recurrent peptic ulcer disease, abdominal pain. They will have recurrent GERD symptoms. And also such patients may present only with the secretory form of diarrhea. Such cases are also been described. A patient with a tumor, somatostatinoma, secreting somatostatin will have cholelithiasis, steatorrhea, diabetes mellitus. A patient with a glucagonoma usually has dermatitis, necrolytic erythema migrans, which is a blistering skin rash in periorificial and intertriginous areas. Diabetes mellitus, weight loss. A patient with a medullary thyroid carcinoma will have symptoms of hypercalcemia due to excess calcitonin. This is a picture of a patient.
Sandeep,
Yes,
what is the effect of somatostatin on blood glucose?
Sir, somatostatin, it causes hyperglycemia.
Okay.
This is a picture of a patient which Jatin saw in his MD days. This patient is a proven case of carcinoid syndrome. In this picture, she had a reddish discoloration of her head and upper chest, and it was associated with a feeling of warmth. This is an endoscopic appearance of a patient with Zollinger-Ellison syndrome or gastrinoma. Here we can see large necrotic ulcerations in the folds of this duodenum with typical sparing of the bases of the folds.
Sandeep, can I make a point here, Sandeep?
Yes, sir.
So this is the most classical form. If ever you see this picture, JDS will come to your mind spontaneously, even to a guy who is just MBBS. But most JDS will not have this finding. We must know this. That this is a classical finding. Classical finding is highly specific, but sensitivity of this finding is not high. So let's not play this picture in our mind that only this picture will make us diagnose of JDS. No, only few will have this classical presentation. Majority will have even a couple of ulcers, they're not healing, right? So, or they may have a gastric ulcer, duodenal ulcer. So keep that in mind. More common with that we have multiple ulcers, but not as many as these you're showing. So this is the problem with our textbooks. Our textbook will give you one or two pictures in print, and they will show you the most classical form. Most classical forms are not all any disease. Everyone doesn't have most classical form, and we as a specialist must keep that in mind. There's always a wide spectrum of manifestations, starting from a single ulcer to which is non-healing or requiring PPI or recurrent ulcers or complication of ulcers, right? Compared to these kind of so classical findings.
Next. So this present case has no such findings or anything in the history. So how will you approach now?
I would like to go with three sets of investigation. One is biological, another is imaging, and third, if I will able to localize the tumor, then certainly the histology. So in biochemical test, the first test we order is chromogranin. It is a pan NET marker. Chromogranin is basically a group of glycoprotein. They are co-stored with the peptides in the granules of the endocrine cells. And there are three types of chromogranin: chromogranin A, B, and C. That is also known as secretogranin 2. So chromogranin A is composed of single polypeptide chains and mainly produced by the endocrine and neuroendocrine cells. The function of chromogranin is to formation and regulation of the dense core granules, heart functions, catecholamines, and PTH secretions, carbohydrate and lipid metabolism, and immune functions. So the measurement of chromogranin is helpful. However, there are three most common conditions, that is use of corticosteroids, use of PPI, and chronic atrophic gastritis. In these three conditions, there can be a false elevated value of the chromogranin. So in a patient, given patient, I would like to go for the chromogranin first, because it can be helpful as a marker of tumor burden, tumor recurrence, and prognosis and reduced survival. And it is used as marker of response to treatment. Biochemical treatment based on chromogranin is defined as reduction of more than or equal to 50% from the baseline. So what is the sensitivity and specificity of the chromogranin to diagnose a neuroendocrine tumor? So overall sensitivity and specificity of the chromogranin to diagnose a neuroendocrine tumor is around 60 to 80%. It depends on the primary site of the tumor, on the degree of differentiation. Yes.
Manas,
Yes.
Go to the list where you have shown cause of secretory diarrhea. Go to the slide. So the endocrine causes, like all these causes,
yes,
are these all causes, all whatever you listed here, is this included in NET?
Sir, except pheochromocytoma and medullary carcinoma of thyroid, sir, rest all are included in the NET.
Okay, in like VIPoma and all those things.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And Manas, you said that patient should be off PPI causes false elevation.
Yes, sir.
So what is the duration where PPI should be off before you get chromogranin test? Or you can get it done on PPI and there will be a separate cutoff?
Yes, sir. The cutoff for the elevated chromogranin is the 60 nanogram per milliliter has shown that it has shown the sensitivity of around 60% and specificity of around 90% for the detecting the NET on PPI therapy, sir.
No, and so if the chromogranin is elevated in a patient with diarrhea, then how sure would you be that this patient is suffering from secretory diarrhea? Can it exclude or can it rule in or rule out secretory diarrhea, chromogranin?
Sir, isolated value of the chromogranin if there is a low pretest probability, then it will not rule in or rule out the secretory diarrhea. But in a given case where there is high pretest probability is there, then it will certainly rule in the secretory diarrhea.
And the cutoff is only 60?
60, sir, yes.
And if the patient is on PPI, do you need to stop PPI before getting it done?
No, sir, no, sir.
PPI can be continued.
PPI can be continued, yes, sir.
But you said PPI can cause elevation, so then?
Sir, PPI can cause elevation of chromogranin. But sir, the value of the chromogranin cutoff in a patient with taking PPI would be not that much elevated as compared to the those secreting the neuroendocrine tumor. Specifically, this is true for the well-differentiated neuroendocrine tumor, sir.
I think say it again. What is our cutoff values of
20.
Indian reports we get from different labs? Not 100.
Sir, 20 nanogram per 20 is the cutoff, sir.
20 something hota. I think less than 100 we don't give a damn to this this report.
20 nanogram per ml is the cutoff, sir. I will recheck, sir.
I think then all of us, at least I have a wrong impression in my mind that 60 to 60 microgram per liter is. I think we need to really look at it. And if
60
so,
nanogram
we are
per liter.
underplaying the report.
Yes.
I think we look at
So
our own.
so
look at our own values in our on the lab which are available, which report we get. You would say more than a couple of hundred becomes irrelevant. Less than that, we don't give importance to this test. Probably this is a point we should learn from this seminar that, or this panel discussion, that more than 60 becomes abnormal.
so, so should chromogranulin be a screening test for secretory diarrhea? If it is normal, then it is ruled out, or
no, sir. No, sir. It is not screening test. It will not rule out.
so then what is its value? Should we do it or should we not do it?
Sir, since it is a pan, unless we know the specific symptoms in patient like described earlier, we should first order, rather than ordering all the peptide levels, we should first go with the chromogranin, sir.
No, but you said it will not rule out. So if it is normal, then
We go ahead with functional imaging, sir, like Dotanoc.
Now, there always scope, no? If history is so classical that you're convinced in your mind that whatever chromogranin may be, I have to go further. Even if it's normal, I have to go further. Then certainly you might skip this test. But suppose you're not, every time you don't get such classical large volume watery diarrhea, in those situations certainly this test will have value. And to give him one more evidence. Saurabh, am I right?
okay.
Am I right? I'm not sure that, but certainly if volume is large watery volume, and this test will not stop you going further, like going a functional imaging or not. But there may be many cases where you're not too sure about it, that is typical secretory diarrhea or not. There this test might be of value.
So because it's a very costly test, so when should we get it done, in which patient? That should be, I think, clear for all the residents that yes, because it costs around 5,000 rupees in the.
True, very true. But just once confirm to me, don't you stop PPI before doing this test?
Sir, for chromogranin, sir.
Don't you stop PPI before doing this test? Yeah.
Sir,
I'm told, or I have been, that we always stop PPI for 2 or 3 weeks before we do this test. So is it wrong practice or the right practice?
Traditionally, we are told to stop PPI for 2 weeks before ordering a test of chromogranin. But as Manas has said, that we can use a different cutoff when the patient was on PPI and the test was ordered. We'll again recheck the cutoffs for on PPI and off PPI. And
I think we need to check it.
Yes, sir.
I'm still not convinced in my own mind that our cutoff are a bit higher, and we don't give importance to this test. At least I'm not giving importance to just mild. 60 is a too low a value, and it never struck my mind 60 could be abnormal. And you always think this is drug induced or otherwise. But if that is so, then probably are we missing this test's importance? Okay.
So now coming to the various peptide hormones, as we come across the patient with secretory type of diarrhea,
should we order all the peptide hormone tests or not? So that should not be the case. This was a study published long back where they found that in a patient with 193 patient of chronic diarrhea, those who had no secretory type of diarrhea, and 8 patients with a non-peptide secreting tumor, they compared both the patient and found that none of the referred patient were found to have tumors of abnormal level who have more 86 and 45% patient had elevated peptide levels in those who did not have any tumor. So abnormal plasma peptide levels were sometimes as high in these patients as in those with non-peptide secreting tumors, and would have led to the mistaken of diagnosis of the tumors much more often. So routine testing of peptide hormone levels may give a false positive value because of less prevalence of NETs, and high pretest probability with clinical suspicion should be considered before ordering the peptide levels in these patients. Similarly, we can measure urinary 5-HIAA in a patient with a carcinoid. This is the typical carcinoid patient will have elevated urinary 5-HIAA with the normal value of urinary 5-HIAA is 2 to 8 milligram per day, and elevated value more than this will have sensitivity of 35% only, but specificity of up to 100%. And in a patient with atypical carcinoid, this will be the false negative. And because the patient with atypical carcinoid will have patient with atypical carcinoids are lacking the enzymes aromatic L-amino acid decarboxylase. So the end product which is secreted in the urine will not be the 5-HIAA, but it will be 5-hydroxytryptamine. So the level of 5-hydroxytryptamine will be increased in the urine. However, the cutoff for the detecting the 5-hydroxytryptamine, we have not come across regarding the specific cutoff for the 5-hydroxytryptamine.
So Manas, go
Yes,
back. So
yes.
should we order serum chromogranin and urinary 5-HIAA both test, or we should go sequentially, or like chromogranin, you told that this is PEN NET.
Yes.
What about when we should order a urinary 5-HIAA?
Sir, in a patient with suspected carcinoid syndrome, we should order urinary 5-HIAA, which has specificity up to 100%.
But not chromogranin?
Not, sir, after chromogranin level, sir. 2 tests. In a suspected patient, once the chromogranin is elevated, in a patient with suspected patient of having carcinoid syndrome, the urinary 5-HIAA will be elevated. But the case is that we come across most of the foregut carcinoid, and in the foregut carcinoid, the level of urinary 5-HIAA will be normal because they secrete 5-hydroxytryptamine.
So suppose that any chromogranin, you will anyway go for functional imaging.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so do we have a role of this test? I'm just asking whether it is hydroxyindolic acid is elevated or not. You will anyway go for functional imaging in every case.
Right, sir.
So what is the significance of this test? I'm just.
So in poorly differentiated NETs, these hormones may not be elevated and cannot. The somatostatin expression may not be there, and they may be missed on functional imaging. So it is better that we complement both biochemical as well as imaging together, because only in well-differentiated NETs we will get the functional uptake.
Okay, go ahead.
Coming to imaging, what imaging modality would you like to do in a patient with suspected NET? We obviously would like to do functional imaging, but most of the times our patients end up getting us the CT which was ordered outside or here. So what are the findings of a neuroendocrine tumor in a on CT? So if the patient gets a non-contrast CT done as seen here, so non-contrast CT, usually the tumor is iso-intense with the surrounding liver and the tumor may be totally missed. So only in contrast enhanced CT or a triple phase CT will be able to identify this NETs. So the findings of NETs in a triple phase CT is that they're highly vascular. So there is arterial hyperenhancement in arterial phase, and there is washout in the venous phase and the delayed phase. And this is the neuroendocrine tumor liver metastasis. So the small intestinal NETs usually are very small to be picked up by CT, but sometimes they can cause large mesenteric masses because of the dense desmoplastic reaction that they cause. They can be identified in the CTs. So appendix neuroendocrine tumors can have features like thickening of the appendix and inflammation kind of a picture. And colonic neuroendocrine tumors are usually large, but it is very difficult for us to differentiate between an NET and adenocarcinoma, because both of them will cause present with circumferential thickening or a polypoidal mass with or without adjacent lymphadenopathy. So hence the CT, these are the findings, but they do not prove that these are NETs. So sometimes like EUS is very good for detecting insulinomas, but however insulinoma do not cause secretory diarrhea. So but EUS is also good for detecting gastrinomas because they occur in the gastrinoma triangle near the D2 junction. So EUS also helps in T staging and possibly N staging for gastric and rectal NETs, and it is also quite sensitive for detecting pancreatic NETs and providing histological confirmation by doing an FNAC. So at least 70% of the gastrinomas are detected by EUS. So coming to the most important part of the NET workup, what is the somatostatin receptor imaging, the DOTANOC, which we usually call. So these neuroendocrine tumors have a specific property that they express high quantity of somatostatin receptors on their tumor cells. So these somatostatin receptors are the G protein coupled receptors which are found on the neuroendocrine cells. This property can be utilized in functional imaging. So these can be used in functional imaging. So just to understand the principle behind DOTANOC. So the DOTANOC, which we usually call, for example, this. 1 second, sir. So the DOTANOC, which we usually call, the actual full form is that it is a 60 gallium labeled sodium iodide octreotide combination. So there are 3 different molecules. So this DOTA combined with sodium iodide acts as a linker or a chelator between a radionuclide, which will glow in the PET scan. And this is the target present on the tumor cells. This is the somatostatin receptor, and this is the somatostatin or somatostatin analog. So what this linker does, like DTPA or DOTA, it will bind both these things. On one arm it has a somatostatin, and another arm it has a radio-labeled nucleotide. So usually we nowadays we are doing a DOTA-NOC PET or a DOTA-TATE PET, which is usually gallium labeled and combined with octreotide, which binds to the receptors on the tumor cells. So when we give this molecule and do a PET scan, these entire molecule go bind to the tumor cells wherever they are in the whole body, and they light up. So the receptors are 5 types, and type 2 is the most common. And these receptors are also functionally active in the sense that they are responsible for the tumor growth and also hormone release of the tumors. And presence of SSTRs can be imaged by the labeling this, as I said. And the sensitivity is around 90%, and the specificity comes to around 95%. So when we combine here, we will only be able to say whether there is uptake in the DOTANOC or not. We will not know the anatomical extent and location. In order to localize, we'll combine it with PET CT, and most well differentiated. The problem with the uptake is that if the patient has a strong possibility, high chromogranin, but there is no uptake on DOTANOC, then what are the possibilities? So there is a possibility that this is a very high grade neuroendocrine tumor, which is poorly differentiated, and it does not have somatostatin receptors on its surface. Then there is a possibility that it will not show uptake on DOTANOC. So that is one problem. So we can combine it with CT to localize the unknown primary and to look at its extent and operability and also distant mets. Also, if the patient has high uptake on Dotanoc, then it will also tell us the prognosis, because these patients are amenable to treatment with somatostatin analogs and PRRT, which is radionuclide ablation, which I'll be discussing subsequently. And this baseline Dotanoc uptake can also help act as a response to treatment. Also, we can measure by comparing it with pre and post treatment. So as I mentioned, the problem with poorly differentiated tumors not expressing Dotanoc, then how will we be able to image them? Then comes the role of FDG PET. So what is the principle of FDG PET? Normal glucose cell, the glucose is taken up by the cell and it will undergo high glucolysis. But in a tumor cell, the fluorodeoxyglucose, which enters the cell, it cannot be utilized for glycolysis, hence gets trapped inside the tumor cells. And this is picked up by the FDG PET. So this is common to all tumors, not just NET. So the poorly differentiated neuroendocrine tumors, which are negative on Dotanoc, can be positive on FDG PET. So nowadays there is a role of combining both FDG PET and Dotanoc. And this is one of the guidelines in nuclear imaging, which showed that Chi67, which is a proliferation index. I will discuss what is it subsequently. So when the Chi67 index is more than 5%, or a patient with worrisome symptoms, worrisome lesions on CT with little or no activity on CT component of SSTR, and patients with clinical or radiological evidence of disease progression despite a low Chi67. These are the three indications where we should order FDG PET along with Dotanoc. So as I said, so here we can see this is an Dotanoc. This is a Dotanoc scan, and this is an FDG scan. So here the glucose is taken by the brain. So this is a FDG. So here is a patient where the lesions are lighted up on DOTA scan. Uptake is present on DOTA, but not on FDG. So this is a well differentiated tumor likely which is expressing somatostatin and lighting up. So based on FDG and somatostatin receptor uptake, so this is grading. So when there is high grade, there is poor differentiation, and there is no uptake on somatostatin. So here comes the role of FDG. So we can also do histopathology when we are not convinced on chromogranin and functional imaging. So usually there are two types: well differentiated and poorly differentiated. Well differentiated usually have a cribriform and organoid architecture with uniform nuclei, and they have a typical salt and peppery chromatin appearance on the biopsy, and these usually have rich vascular network. On the other hand, the poorly differentiated tumors have sheets or nests of atypical cells with very hyperchromatic nuclei, and this salt and pepper appearance is lost in these poorly differentiated, and you can also find necrosis in these patients. This is a poor prognostic subset. So immunohistochemistry can also be utilized. There are neuroendocrine.
Jitan, I have a question. You mentioned in the previous slide that the patients who express SSTR receptors properly, they do not take FDG PET.
No, sir. Yes, sir. In the FDG PET, there is not much uptake because they are very well differentiated tumors, and the proliferation index is very low. So they are not like a very rapidly proliferating tumors, because well differentiated NETs have a very good prognosis, and their proliferation index is very low. So this is the proliferation index. So they're very slow growing tumors. With
it is because they have low proliferation activity. That's why glucose is not being taken up by these cells.
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay.
So this is a proliferation marker which I have said that indicates whether it is a good well differentiated or not. So synaptophysin and chromogranin are the neuroendocrine markers. We can do immunohistochemistry to confirm the diagnosis of NET in a patient. So this is the new WHO grading. I don't want to go into the details, but the terminology is that whether it is well differentiated or poorly differentiated. And see, this well differentiated or polar differentiation is whether they are expressing the NETs or not. This is on the biopsy, and the proliferation index is also correlating with the same. So poorly differentiated tumors have high proliferation index, mitotic rate, and they are considered as high grade. They are termed as neuroendocrine carcinoma. So this is the grading of the NETs. So in our index case, the chromogranin levels were normal, but because the pretest probability was very high and strong suspicion, we went ahead with Dotanoff scan, and which showed positive uptake in a pancreatic tail, size of which was less than 2 centimeter, and the VIP levels were more than 2 times elevated. Mahinder sir?
So sorry, sir. This is not. We have taken. This is a
Hypothetical
case.
patient, sir. This is not actually done.
Next slide.
So now that we have approached the diagnosis, just to touch on the principles.
Very summary, sir. Jatin, not in detail.
Yes, sir. So the two-pronged approach, one is symptom control. We have to counsel the patient because these patients have significant dehydration as in this patient. We have to counsel them to keep lots of ORS with them and counsel them strictly to take 200 ml after every stool. And in a patient with Zollinger and Ellison syndrome, we need to give do aggressive acid control to prevent ulcer and related complication. Somatostatin analogs can have a role in both control of the tumor as well as diarrheal control. So if there are localized disease, we go ahead and do the surgery and they have excellent prognosis. And if they are inoperable or metastatic disease, still we go ahead with debulking surgery because we reduce the tumor bulk and the amount of peptides releasing will be reduced. And if it is a progressive disease, we'll do something called as PRRT and chemotherapy. So what is this PRRT? So somatostatin analogs, we can give either octreotide long-acting or lanreotide. Octreotide is given subcutaneously and lanreotide is intramuscular. This is the dose. We give it an interval of 4 weeks and they lead to both a symptomatic biochemical and tumor response. So this is the efficacy. All of them are both of them are comparable. Only thing is the route. So the second option in inoperable patients is PRRT, which is peptide receptor radionuclide therapy. This is something like a radionuclide thyroid ablation therapy. We can compare it to that. So this is a targeted receptor-based radiotherapy treatment where we target these somatostatin receptors and we give ablating agents instead of gallium, with just which is just gallium is just diagnostic, but this is therapeutic luteum. So this will go and kill the tumor cells. So this dotatate is an approved US FDA approved thing, and obviously only the well-differentiated ones with good receptor can be candidates for PRRT. So just briefly, these are the well-differentiated. These are the poorly differentiated. Well-differentiated patients are positive on Dotanac but FDG negative, and this is an approach to metastatic patients. Here, when they are good prognosis with SSTR Dotanoc positive, we can go ahead and do PRRT. If the patients are poorly differentiated and they are Dotanoc negative but positive on PET, they have to undergo chemotherapy. So capecitabine and temozolomide is the usual protocol followed for NET. In case of intermediate tumors, if it is positive for both, then we go ahead and do both sandwich therapy, PRRT followed by chemotherapy. So to summarize, clinical history is very important. We should ask the patient if it is a typical watery and the volume, and stool osmolar gap is something which we do not do usually, but it can prevent unnecessary investigations and help establish the diagnosis of secretory diarrhea in a given patient. And we have discussed the diagnosis and localization of neuroendocrine tumors, and biochemical tests like chromogranin is a pan NET marker which can be utilized for any type of NET. And functional imaging we have discussed. So routine peptide hormone assay may give false positive results and are less useful in approach to NET. So this is the only type of diarrhea which can be cured by surgery, and it is important that we understand the principles of diagnosis and treatment.
Thank you, Jatin, Manas and Sandeep. Now the panel is open for discussion. Any question?
Any question? Anybody has any question?
If none, then we can wind up the session.
Okay. So anybody has any question? I think this was a good seminar and good panel discussion, done very well by all four of you, Mahendra, Jatin, Manas, and Sandeep. So, but this is very important because I want to highlight two things: that always ask volume. Three things important in diarrhea: frequency, volume, and type of content. And if you have three questions clear, you will make a good clinical differential diagnosis. But never miss out large volume watery diarrhea, which are not very infrequent. They are not very common also, but not very infrequent. And doing endoscopy in these patients may not yield anything, because doing endoscopy biopsies from upper GI, lower GI will not yield much, right? And the second point is that we are trying to work out on estimation of sodium potassium in the stool, so that we can establish this test in our lab as a facility. Hopefully this year we should be able to do it. Vikas is working on it. We have found some machines also which can estimate sodium potassium in the stool. Just trying to finalize the equipment, and probably will procure maybe in this year itself. All right.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. We'll close the session.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.